Let's take a look at policy for Zscaler private access. So it's important again to understand the order of operations, slightly different for private access compared to Zscaler internet access. So it starts with the client connector connecting to the service edge. As part of that connection, the service edge understands, is it the Zscaler client connector that provides information about the user credentials, or the user logging into the exporter and the authentication token being provided. The SAML SCIM device posture is evaluated as part of that connection. The service edge makes a client forwarding policy for Zscaler client connector, and that's the definition based on the policy of what app segments the user is allowed to download or the client connector can download. With browser-based access, the user is logging into the exporter function, and as part of that authentication, the service edge identifies which applications the user is allowed to see and therefore which ones they're allowed to connect to. The client connector downloads its client forwarding policy. The user makes a request for an application on there, and so the client then connects to the application. The client connector connects to the service edge and the request is made. Or the user makes the request from the service edge from the exporter. Once again, as part of every transaction, the SAML SCIM attribute, the segment information is provided and that policy is evaluated. And the first thing that's going to be evaluated is the time policy. Should the user re-authenticate based on these timeouts? Then the access policy is evaluated based on the criteria provided, the SAML SCIM device information, the application segment. Is the user allowed or denied access to that? Then apply an isolation policy. Should the user be isolated for this transaction? And then when the transaction is allowed through, whether it's isolated from the exporter or from the client connector, inspection policy will be applied for those transactions. We're then going to make a decision on which app connector is going to service that request. The tunnels are established, and then the traffic flows between the client connector, the app connector, and from the app connector to the application. So private access policy is predicated first off on SAML attributes and SCIM attributes. And a SAML attribute might have user attributes as well as device attributes. And a SCIM attribute is entirely device-based but is pushed through the SCIM sync. So if we look on the right-hand side here, we can see a bunch of SAML attributes, the surname, the tenant ID, the email address, are all user-based credentials, the identity provider, the user principal name. But in green, we also see device attributes returned from Azure AD. Is the device known? Is the device managed? Is the device compliant against the compliance policy? When we look at the SCIM attributes or the SCIM group information, these are all user-based. The user email address, the nickname, the username, and then the user is a member of Internet ZPA-enabled groups. So SCIM is entirely user-based. SAML may contain device information as well for us to apply policy on. We also get device attributes from the connection, so we want to understand either the device posture information. Did the device pass these posture checks? We understand the trusted network criteria for the device. Is it in the data center? Is it in the branch? Is it a roaming user? And then we also consume information about the client type. Is it a client connector? Is it a web browser? Is it an isolated browser? Have we been forwarded traffic through the Zero Trust Exchange from the Zscaler Internet Access Service? And then obviously we also have other forwarding mechanisms that might be the cloud connector or machine tunnels for passing traffic through to the Zero Trust Exchange. So the policy order, similar to Zscaler Internet Access, is top-down first match. There's an implied default deny at the bottom, and the same as any firewall policy. So you'd make an explicit allow for an application segment in policy, and then you can either write an explicit deny for that segment, or if all of your other policies are explicit, you can leave it for the default deny to happen at the bottom. It's a question of how tidy or how explicit you want your access policy to be. Policy types, we have access policy. Is the user allowed or denied access? The timeout policy, when should the user re-authenticate to access the application? The client forwarding policy makes a decision which application segments will the client connector get as its definitions. The isolation policy dictates should this transaction be moved into the isolated container. And then the inspection policy as to whether or not ZPA inspection policy will apply to these transactions.